Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. For those of you who are new to the Umoja Circle, this is the African-centered talk show where the purpose of it is to correct errors where errors are found and to introduce facts where we find that so many of us are working on fiction when it comes to who we are and the dynamics of being black in America. And this is a topic that tends to get pushed to the side or only be talked about when things blow up in the environment and society at large. But I try to focus solely on, because I have no problem being black. And being black is an everyday thing. And there's certain situations and unique issues that are unique to the black culture. And I talk about those things and the dynamic and how they interrelate to the white culture. But before I continue with the topic, which is part 2 of my discussion from last show, which tried to talk about the history of racism. But before we get to that, I got a video I want you to see, and here we go.
The Stanford Prison Experiment is possibly the most famous psychological experiment of all time, an insane role-playing game gone horribly wrong, thanks to nylon stockings, fire extinguishers, and a sadist nicknamed John Wayne. So what really happened behind those prison walls? Here's a look at the untold truth of the Stanford Prison Experiment. The experiment begins. With funding from the U.S. Office of Naval Research, Dr. Philip Zimbardo began the Stanford Prison Experiment in August 1971 to study the effects of prison life and examine the power dynamic between inmates and guards. As he later wrote in his book, The Lucifer Effect, Zimbardo wanted to know, if you put good people in a bad place, do the people triumph or does the place corrupt them? He began by putting an ad in the paper for volunteers who would be paid $15 a day to participate, about $93 in today's cash after inflation. After selecting 24 guinea pigs, Zimbardo and his assistants converted the basement of Stanford's psychology department building into a makeshift prison, then flipped a coin to decide which test subjects would be guards and which would be prisoners. It would turn out to be a fateful decision. Welcome to prison. The experiment began when real-life cops pretended to arrest the students playing prisoners. They were hauled to the actual Palo Alto Police Department, booked, fingerprinted, and then blindfolded and tossed in a holding cell. Once they were transferred to the fake prison, things got a lot worse. The prisoners were ordered to strip naked, doused with a spray, forced to wear dress-like garments without underwear, and nylon stockings as hats, and fit with a chain locked around one ankle. The students playing guards were also encouraged to make up their own rules, leading to 17 strict guidelines the prisoners were forced to live by. Prisoners were only allowed to refer to themselves by number, and guards would randomly wake them up in the middle of the night with screeching whistles and force them to exercise. Zimbardo even got into the act himself, playing the prison superintendent, where he always sided with the guards and encouraged them to create a sense of fear among the inmates. But the prisoners soon began fighting back. The prisoners rebel. On the second day, the prisoners went on strike, removing their hats and the numbers from their uniform, and blocking the cell doors with their cots to keep the guards from entering. That's when things got even darker. The guards on duty called for reinforcements and used a fire extinguisher to force the inmates away from the door. After forcing their way in, they removed the cots, forcing inmates to sleep on the floor, and refused to let the prisoners eat or brush their teeth. They also threw the ringleaders of the insurrection into solitary confinement and forced others to clean toilets with their bare hands, while spreading rumors that some inmates were informing on the others in the hopes of getting preferential treatment. Finally, the guards stopped letting the prisoners use the toilets at all, forcing them to do their business in buckets, which they weren't allowed to empty, turning the whole fake prison into a giant open sewer. Prisoner number 8612 loses his mind. Less than 36 hours into the experiment, Douglas Corpy, aka prisoner number 8612, apparently lost his mind from the stress. One of the ringleaders during the rebellion, Corpy had been thrown into solitary confinement and was a target of harassment from the guards. According to Zimbardo, Corpy began screaming and crying, although the doctor and his staff initially thought he was just faking it in an attempt to escape. Eventually, they let him out, fearing for his mental health. Corpy later claimed he faked it all, telling SF Gate, "The breakdown I had was a manipulation to get out of that damn experiment." But in a documentary made by Zimbardo, Corpy told a different story.
It was an experience of being out of control, both of the situation and of my feelings.
Meet John Wayne. One guard in particular was noted for his sadistic tendencies. His real name was Dave Eshelman, but the prisoners called him John Wayne, though in fact he consciously modeled himself after the villainous prison warden from the Paul Newman movie Cool Hand Luke, going so far as to use a southern accent when speaking to the prisoners. Eshelman orchestrated all sorts of terrible hazing, forcing the prisoners to play leapfrog so their gowns would ride up and expose their privates. He once ordered 2 prisoners to act as Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein, forcing them to embrace while saying, "I love you." As his final infamous act, Eshelman forced several of the prisoners to simulate intercourse. Tellingly, the other guards didn't stop his actions.
I started to get so profane that, and still people didn't say anything.
According to Eshelman, though, he's not really sadistic at all, but actually a good guy who was simply trying to expose the evils inherent in a prison-type environment. He told Stanford magazine, "I set out with a definite plan in mind, to try to force the action, force something to happen, so that the researchers would have something to work with." From Eshelman's perspective, any blame lies with Zimbardo.
Nobody was telling me I shouldn't be doing this. The professor is the authority here. He's the prison warden. He's not stopping me.
Things fall apart. Over the course of less than 1 week, 5 students playing prisoners had to be released due to severe psychological issues caused by the abuse of their guards. Perhaps the worst was the case of prisoner number 819, who broke down weeping. When Zimbardo allowed him to rest in a nearby room, however, the prison guards lined up all the other inmates outside the door and forced them to chant, "Prisoner number 819 did a bad thing," over and over again, until the poor guy was reduced to a blubbering wreck.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
He was eventually replaced by a new guinea pig, prisoner number 416, who was so horrified by what he saw in the prison, he immediately staged a hunger strike in protest. Guards responded by tossing him into solitary confinement. The experiment had gone off the rails, and the only man who could stop it had lost all perspective. As Zimbardo put it himself, "I had become the superintendent of the Stanford County Jail. That was who I was. I'm not the researcher at all." Luckily, someone with perspective showed up on day 5. Zimbardo's then-girlfriend, Christina Maslach, was an assistant professor at Berkeley. After showing up to help with the experiment, she was appalled to see the prisoners chained together with paper bags over their heads. She confronted him that night.
We had a long argument. At the end of it, he then decided, this is it, I've got to shut down the prison. And so then the next day, everything stopped.
The experiment was supposed to run for 2 weeks. It had only lasted 6 days. Aftermath. Shortly after the experiment ended, the horrific uprising in Attica prison took place, thrusting Zimbardo and his research into the spotlight. Researchers are still arguing about what it all means. Zimbardo himself has said it goes to show how normal people can be turned evil by circumstance, telling the BBC, "The study is the classic demonstration of the power of situations and systems to overwhelm good intentions of participants and transform ordinary, normal young men into sadistic guards." Others aren't so sure, as some critics think Zimbardo unintentionally skewed his results with his methods, which may have attracted participants who are much more aggressive and less empathetic than the general populace. Plus, Zimbardo wasn't just a scientific observer. He actively participated and even encouraged violence and brutality, corrupting his data in the process. Tellingly, when psychologists conducted a similar experiment in 2001, they remained observers, and the guards never got anywhere near as aggressive as John Wayne and his cohorts did at Stanford. The significance of the Stanford prison experiment came into question again in 2004, when a group of American soldiers tortured and humiliated Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison. Zimbardo was called to testify as an expert on behalf of one of the defendants, who claimed the system encouraged the guards to act violently. Zimbardo agreed, saying Abu Ghraib was a Stanford prison study on steroids. The defendant still received 8 years behind bars, however, which some might consider an ironically fitting epilogue to the saga of the Stanford prison experiment.
Well, welcome back to what do you think about that video? I showed it at the beginning of last show, but I also wanted to show it to those who might have missed the last show and in the second part 2 of this discussion. Now, why did I put a video on about the Stanford prison experiment of 1971? It was done in Palo Alto, again in 1971. There was like 20 or so, as the video said, young white men who were middle class, who looked at the police. As you see in the video, some of them might have thought it was funny. Police took them in handcuffs and they went through the booking process, and they went into the basement of the psychology department there in Stanford University, and they created a very small environment to replicate a prison. all right? Prison that people of African descent have been dealing with for long as we've been in America, practically. But these white kids who were part of the white privilege group, and I'll talk about that in the terms of racism, didn't have a clue. Within 24 hours, you would notice that there was a change in their behavior. The environment, that simple environment, that sitting where they were restricted of who they could be, restricted from their own way of thinking and interacting, they had been controlled. And those who were put in control, the students who became the prison guards, took that personality within 24 hours. What does that have to do with racism? Well, let's expand it a little bit. But before, to 246 years of slavery, where the whole country, or the 13 colonies, was an environment similar to this basement experiment in Stanford University in 1971. And just think about the dynamics between the whites who had control and the people of African descent who didn't have control. But I'm gonna get to that history in a minute. Before I talk about racism, let me put up what racism is, okay? Okay, don't get this mixed up with prejudice. It is a system of power created by laws for the benefit of one group in the society solely based on the color of their skin, which gave the dominant white society 100% of control over the politics, the laws, the economic, the resources, and wealth of the American society. This is since 1619, okay? Racism also embedded in it is a word. Racism is in the word racism. Embedded in that word is race. Okay, race. That means a group of people, a particular race. There were two groups at least since 1619, where one group in the society had all the owned and controlled so much in the society that they could use their power and social gains on another group. And that's what white America was embedded into. Last week I said that we are a nation of laws. And what I meant was that laws give you, creates an environment, socially engineer an environment that is basically safe. If everybody followed the laws, everybody's followed traffic laws, or how to act in certain environments. It teaches you how not only to act, but it conditions you, socially engineered you. And I'm gonna use that term over and over again. There are people called social scientists who every day at universities all over the country and all over the world determines certain experiments similar to what happened in 1971. It just didn't happen in that one year. It's been going on back until, from the 50s at least, until today. And how to deal with group dynamics, how to deal with a culture, a society, all right? There's social scientists who put out that information, and that information is used by city governments, state governments, particular institutions. Every time you see a commercial, believe me, there was some social scientist who determined what would affect the people who looking at that commercial. You are socially engineered. I remember when I was a kid, when my mother would say, instead of saying bleach, she would say Clorox. Now, she didn't mean the product Clorox. Clorox is the brand name. She meant bleach. But she was socially engineered by simple commercials, conditioned to see Clorox because that had the most commercials out there. When people say Tylenol, I'm gonna take some Tylenol. Tylenol is a brand name. It is not the chemical. That's acetaminophen. Okay, people don't say I'm gonna take some acetaminophen. They say Tylenol, even though they might take another product that has acetaminophen in it, or you'll get it from from the hospital. It's still a Tylenol. It's still, even I said that. It's still acetaminophen. So you are conditioned to think a certain way. Do not get it. Do not get again. I can't state this over and over again. We have been being conditioned in the last 30 to 40 years. When I was a kid, what you would throw around the word racism about would be what we were taught in school was prejudice. And here the definition of prejudice. Prejudice means you have a preconceived feeling based on previous experience about something, situation, or event. Discrimination allows you to discriminate. Every human being on earth, in order to live, must discriminate. You can't go, be biased and must be prejudiced. That's natural. Racism is not a natural phenomenon. It is a social construct, okay? So once I say that, you can't go through the woods and just eat anything you see growing out of you have to be able to discriminate. Okay, you can't. You got to discriminate between what mushrooms you can eat and what give you hallucination and what will kill you. What plants to eat. You have to be discriminating. But when you use that natural way of being in a system that one group dominates another, then that's what we call racism. That's it. You cannot. Black people cannot be racist. We were never part of the white dominant group since 1619, okay? We have never been in power where we can control, subordinate, and the white population in this country. So we can never be racist, all right? Regardless, we could be prejudiced, discriminating, and all those other things that is natural for all human beings, but we don't have the power or in a position of power to use that system to another group and dominate that group. The next, I want to, let me show you where the cornerstone of racism was established. It's called the Maryland Doctrine of Exclusion. This was in 1638 with a colony of Maryland, okay? The people in charge, just like people in charge in the Stanford experiment, set a system of laws, okay? Where it says, and I quote, "Neither the existing black population, their descendants, nor any other black shall be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society." They put that in law. It's actually called the Edict of Exclusion. This was a law that was established way back in 1638. Not 1938, 1638. When you follow those laws if you were white, when you had to submit to those laws if you were black, you had to think a certain way. And if those laws were on the book for years and years and years, look what happened to those Stanford young men. Within a day, they were acting one dominant and one in a position as a subordinate position. And you think white America is not affected by the laws that was established? Well, what that got to do with 2019? But let me continue with my thesis here. You had laws like this, the Edict of Maryland. Then other states started following. They started having their edict. And in 1705, you had the Edict of Virginia. Okay, and from the Edict of Virginia, you had these things which expanded the Edict of 1638 Edict. This came in 1710. There was some more in 1665, when the colonial masters in England were telling the House of Burgesses in Virginia and other versions of colonial Congress in all the other 13 states There was the system was not capitalism; it was called mercantilism. That's where they already had the concept of gold. You were wealthy based on the amount of gold you made or silver in your coffers. And when Columbus bumped into this landmass, and the Europeans started coming over here in mass, they came over here to make money. And that's what I mean, like tobacco and cotton and rice and all these other kinds of cash crops. First, they had indentured servants that were white people who were cleaning out the jails and of the city and indenturing them. And there were some blacks who went under that system who came over here as indentured. And the term indentured means because the contract was folded, and where was the indented, there was a copy on each side, and you would give one was kept by the master and given to the indentured, and he had to work 5 or 7 years. Okay, and up until from 1619, some blacks were under those systems, and this went on until again the cornerstone of racism, where based on color, the first mention of color in 1638. Then in 1635, again, the masters in Europe, the lords and the British Tea Company and those who controlled the colonies were saying, we need more gold in our coffers. We give you the land, you got the access to all this land here in the States, in Americas. We need more products. So you give us the raw material. That's how mercantilism was. The colonies produced the raw material. It was shipped to England. The factories there produced the cotton. The cotton was turned into cloth, or the coal and whatever was coming over, and then they would resell that at a profit back to the colonies. That was the mercantilism. But they were saying they were getting more, they wanted more and more wealth. And that's how England and France and Spain and Portugal became wealthy, because of the labor that was done in the expansion of the Americas. People didn't come over here for religious freedom, as it's said. People think that the Pilgrims came over for religious freedom. That was the myth. They came from the Netherlands, all right? And in the Netherlands, they had religious freedom. But it was the bias, again, of the Pilgrims who didn't want to be around Catholics and other Jews and all the other religious groups that were there in the Netherlands who had religious freedom alongside of them. They were biased, and they wanted a place where they didn't have to deal with these biases. They weren't persecuted. They left because of their natural religious bias, and they came to the Americas, to establish their colonies, but to make wealth, just like any other mercantile individual. So, but they had to use gang labor for cotton, for all these other products that need to be shipped back overseas. And who did they use? Well, they had used those people who were already starting to get discriminated again by the Edict of 1638. This was 1665. And then by 1710, Virginia started these things that were called black codes. And let me show you what black codes meant. I'll put up a little statement there. In U.S. history, any set of rules based on the concept that enslaved were property, not person, inherent in the institution of slavery were certain social controls, which slave owners amplified with laws to protect not only the property, but also the property owner from the dangers of slave violence. Just like in the experiment that I showed you in the video, there were certain behavioral patterns that were established. Who was the dominant? The guards. Who was the subordinate? And how you controlled them? You didn't want them to lash out at you. You had certain types of rules. And here's some of the things that they couldn't do under these slave codes. Okay? You had movement restrictions, just like in that prison experiment. They even had a marriage restriction. Most places restricted marriage rights of enslaved people, ostensibly to prevent them from trying to change masters by marrying into a family with another, or another population. You couldn't even gather. Any more than 6 people had to have a white person in their presence. You want to know how racist thinking come in? When you see people today still calling, blacks who are walking in their neighborhoods, they don't know who it is, or barbecuing in the park, you get a white woman. This kind of thinking started with those kind of laws, all right? Then you have slave patrols. In the slave-dependent portion of the North America, varying degrees of legal authority, had these patrols by the plantation owners, free whites, to ensure that enslaved people were not free to move about at night. So they had patrol. You think our criminal justice system and how we are looked at, you think protect and serve meant for us? We were not part of the white privilege of this country. We were part of the subordinate group and the kind of culture that came out of that. Next is some more slave codes that came into being. Trade and commerce. We couldn't compete. You couldn't own anything. All right. You couldn't even be. You could be. A white person could not even be punished for killing a slave. And the last thing I have here is a statement that I want to tie everything back to today before I go. Let me read this. This is a very powerful statement by a black psychologist, Dr. Wade Noble. Ironically, he was also trained at Stanford University. The actions of a community become the experience of a generation, and the experience of one generation become the history of the next generation, while the history of several generations become the cultural tradition of a people. The actions of 1619, the actions of 1638, the action of 1710 became the experience of those generations. And the experience of those generation, of that one generation, became the history of the next generation. And while the history of multiple generations became the ingrained culture of the society. We, in this culture, white American culture, is that multiple generation that became the culture embedded in the psyche. Racism is embedded in the psyche of America. And until we have this conversation, until we understand the truth of what we're up against, it has nothing to do with prejudice. And don't let anybody delude you out, what it means to be that way. There's an old saying is when everybody has it, then it means nothing. So that's what they're trying to tell you. Don't be fooled. Racism is real. It's part of the culture. But I have to go. So peace, hotep, bye-bye.